Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about some different art supplies and ways to use them. This is especially helpful if you are doing your art class from home this year to kind of see ways to use these materials and materials that can replace each other. So whenever you make art, the first thing you want to do is figure out what type of paper you need. I have computer paper. Computer paper is very thin. It's not the best for painting, but you can paint on computer paper. It's great for drawing, especially with Sharpies and pencils. Crayons work fine, pastels work fine too. When I'm using computer paper, it's usually when I'm using markers or colored pencils. Next, I have a piece of white construction paper. It's a lot thicker than computer paper. It has a texture to it. I like to use pastels and crayons on construction paper. If you use markers, they can spread a little bit, which is fine if you don't care about a crisp line. I also like colored pencils on construction paper. Here I have a piece of heavyweight paper. It's great for mixed media. This is usually what's in a sketchbook or what art teachers like to use in their classrooms. It's great for pretty much anything: painting, colored pencils, crayons, pastels, markers, Sharpies. It's my favorite paper to use. And then I have a piece of watercolor paper here that everybody doesn't have, but it's great for watercolors. I use other paints on it too. So I'm going to show you all of these different papers today. I'm going to start with the regular mixed media heavyweight paper that most art rooms have. And I'm going to compare crayons and pastels first. So if you're watching any videos online where the art teacher's using pastels, you can replace that with crayons. They're very similar. The only difference is pastels will smear and mix, but they feel the same. I feel like they cover very similar. So if I draw a circle and color it in, it's not going to smear when I go to wipe those little wax flakes off. But if I use a pastel, okay, and I go to smear, or if I go to wipe it off, it might smear a little bit, especially if you press very hard. You can see I'm smearing the pastel. And really, if you're not going to be blending colors, I say use crayons, it's fine. If you want to blend colors together or smear, pastels are the way to go. So I'm just going to color some pastels, and you can buy pastels anywhere: Walmart, Target, Michael's, Amazon. So you can blend colors together with pastels. One of my favorite things to do with pastels is to color white on top of a color. So if I color, and I like to color on not white paper with pastels. I don't have any construction paper crayons with me, but construction paper crayons work great on construction paper too. But pastels will show up much better than crayons. There's the pink crayon versus the pink pastel. And you can see the pastel much better on the construction paper than the crayon. And something that I like to do is, if I color a color, I like to take white and use the white to kind of blend the color to make more of a gradient. So that's crayons and pastels. Something else about crayons and pastels that makes them different from colored pencils is that if you use them, you can paint on top of them with watercolors and you can see them much better. So I'm going to show you that. We use yellow for this so it's easier to see. So I'm gonna make some stars here with a crayon and with a pastel. Like I said, if you're not blending colors, they really look very similar when you use them on paper. So I have a watercolor set here. I'm going to talk more about paint in a few minutes, but I get my watercolors nice and wet. And you can see the watercolors don't stick to the crayons and pastels. I'd say even better with the crayons because I colored nice and dark. So that's something you can do, and that's called a resist with the crayons and the pastels and watercolors. Okay, so a resist does not work with every art material. It has to be a water-based paint with pastels or crayon. We can add water to other paints, like these are liquid acrylic paints. So I've got my crayon here. And if I want to try to make a resist with this paint, I just need to use a lot of water, a little bit of paint. And it does not work as well. It does work a little bit. I can kind of wipe the extra paint off and see the crayon okay. So if you don't have watercolors at home, but you do have liquid paints and you want to do a resist, you can sort of do one using very watered down liquid paint. I'm going to talk about markers now. So permanent markers will not spread out if you get them wet. So if you wanted to draw a picture with a pencil and trace it with Sharpie and then paint it, that would work. I would not use a washable marker to trace a drawing that you're going to paint. So I'm going to draw a heart here, and then I'm going to use a washable marker. Although this is a little bit dried out. Now I'm going to show you painting it. So if you paint over Sharpie or any type of permanent marker, it does not smear the marker, but if you paint over a washable marker, it does smear. Sometimes you may be wanting to do that. You might want to use the washable markers sort of as paint, and that's great. But if that's not your goal, if your goal is to have an outline that does not smear, then I would use a permanent marker or a colored pencil. But yeah, the washable markers, you can sort of make paint out of those. So that's the difference between a permanent marker or a washable marker. And I'm going to talk about colored pencils. Really, we use colored pencils when we want to color in something really small and detailed, because it's much easier than using a crayon or a pastel. If I drew really small little circles, then it's much easier to color them in with a colored pencil. If you use a pastel, pastels will cover over Sharpie or any type of permanent marker. And a crayon won't cover over the permanent marker, but sometimes it's hard to color inside of very small details with a crayon that's not sharp like this one. So those are some drawing supplies. I am going to talk about the paint, which I've sort of touched on. You can try to replace watercolors with watered down liquid paints of whatever type you have. I was showing you the watercolor paper before, and I'm going to show you the difference of computer paper and watercolor paper with these watercolors here. Just to show you the difference. Obviously, if all you have is computer paper, then definitely use that. So I'm just going to paint with watercolors, and you can already see where it went through the paper I was using earlier. It's just so thin and it's starting to wrinkle, and it does go through to my surface. So if you are painting on computer paper with watercolors, definitely put something underneath and don't press very hard or you'll rip holes in it. If you have construction paper or sketchbook paper, that's definitely better. And this is watercolor paper, so it's made for watercolors. It just spreads out much better. It has a texture to it. And also something I like about watercolors, my water's probably dirty, but if I paint some water on my paper and start painting it, the paint will stay in the water, so it'll spread out into the water puddle, but it won't go anywhere else. And also, I love letting it drip. So, something that I just like about watercolors, and I also like how well they blend on watercolor paper. You can also use liquid paints on watercolor paper just fine. They mix much more easily to me, although watercolors mix great too. I feel like I have more control when I'm using these liquid paints versus watercolors. And also something good about liquid paint is you can paint on other surfaces. Like this is just a granola bar box, and watercolors really absorb down into it and the colors don't show up as well. But liquid paint shows up great on surfaces like this, and also on construction paper it does the same thing. Watercolors don't show up as well. Okay, just kind of gets absorbed into the paper, but liquid paint shows up much better. So I hope that you found this helpful this summer or this school year while you are making art at home, thinking about replacing different art supplies with other supplies. Pastels and crayons are great to replace each other. Colored pencils work really well for coloring in small spaces, but you can't do a resist with a colored pencil. Markers are great on lots of types of paper, but if you're going to paint on top of your marker, use a permanent marker unless you're trying to smear your marker because they're washable. And watercolors work great for blending colors and doing resists like this, and liquid paint works great on construction paper and other surfaces like cardboard. So have fun making some art using all different art supplies.